Thank you very much, Andrea, for your introduction. I will speak in Spanish, so if you don't understand Spanish, I invite you to take the simultaneous translation. Voy a hacer un pequeño repaso, un breve repaso a cuál es.
I would like to briefly review the research about ayahuasca in the recent years and what is the status quo about ayahuasca currently, mainly in Europe. And my colleague, Rafael Guimaraes, will do the same, and he will focus more on the situation about the research on ayahuasca in the rest of the world, especially in Brazil. The scientific research with ayahuasca in Europe started off with Dr. Jordi Riba. He conducted the first pharmacological studies, and he characterized the subjective effects of ayahuasca, and he realized that ayahuasca would be dose dependent. So in the habitual scales to assess the subjective effects of hallucinogenics, depending on the doses, the scales would go up, and the subjective effects were related to the DMT concentrations in blood. He also observed that the brain activity registered with an electroencephalography also followed the course of DMT, and that could be recorded with encephalography techniques. And maybe one of the most interesting things was this neuroimaging study reporting, activations in the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, also a structure related to memory, and cingulate and the insula, areas in the brain that have to do with becoming aware of emotions, and prefrontal cortex to relate to reality. This is the area of the brain to relate to reality, and that is the effect of ayahuasca, maybe the most characteristic effect, having a vision of reality deeply integrated in the bodily identity and with autobiographical memories. Then subsequently we had Dr. Rafael Guimaraes. He will be the next speaker. He also was part of this path of research, and he characterized the pharmacological effects of ayahuasca in repeated doses and also in comparison with amphetamines, because the two compounds have a brain activation pattern. The São Paulo group, the Hospital São Paulo group, they've conducted their own research exploring what the psychological basis could be to explain the therapeutical changes, especially comparing with mindfulness techniques or decentering techniques. While, on the other hand, in the lab in São Paulo, they were carrying out the pharmacological study, administering ayahuasca pharmacologically in the lab. We ourselves at ICEERS, we started our research in collaboration with Dr. Riba as well, and we focused more on researching the effects, long-run effects of the consumption of ayahuasca for people who had been taking it for years. The first study that had been done at all before we started was the ayahuasca project, and they researched 15 people belonging to the Santo Daime church. Neuropsychological variables were assessed about personality, subjective and pharmacokinetic effects after having taken ayahuasca. However, the information was scarce, very discreet about long-term effects, and that is what we wanted to take a look upon. At ICEERS, let me take an aside for a moment, because we at ICEERS follow three basic pillars. First one being public policies need to be based on human rights, promoting social change, which is what we try to do. This needs to happen from a bottom-up perspective, and we need to do this from an evidence-based science perspective. But we work with grassroots movements, and we are now starting to work even with indigenous communities. So evidence, scientific evidence as it is usually considered, in the sense that, well, scientific evidence response to a pyramid is not that easy. You know, at the top of the pyramid we would have systematic reviews and meta-analyses, then at the bottom randomized trials, then underneath that we would go to observational studies, and then case control studies and medical reviews. That's reductionist, because there are more and more researchers that do understand, I include myself, we understand that these methodologies, rather than being a hierarchy, they complement each other. You know, clinical trials are very reliable, also internally speaking, about what happens in the lab, but they don't have that much external validity in relation to what happens in the real world. With observational studies, it's the opposite. You have fine, detailed information about what happens in reality. However, there's not a single controlled variable, so not causality is not assessed. So we try to combine different sorts of evidence, and we conduct clinical trials, we do observational/naturalistic studies, population-based studies, ethnographical studies, and intercultural studies, as I will try to explain in a minute. The first observational studies focused on the Santo Daime community in Brazil, also Barquinha. We went to Mapiá, and we assessed the greatest population sample that had ever assessed until the recent one, with over 120 people. And there we administered classical questionnaires to see whether, for instance, ayahuasca, from a behavioral point of view, causes what other drugs cause. And for us, this is clearly a no, but we needed to prove that from a medical scientific point of view. We had the severity index, and we administered it as well, and we realized that the ayahuasca communities, of course, didn't fulfill those criteria. We had a group in Mapiá, a control group in Boca do Acre, the nearest town, and in order to compare what happened in an urban context faced with a rural one, we went to Rio Branco. 300,000 inhabitants there, coexisting, you know, ayahuasca, people consuming and not consuming ayahuasca. We analyzed some of the variables that you see here: personality, psychopathology, life attitudes, neuropsychological performance, without encountering any alterations. And we wanted to make sure, because this was the first study and we wanted it to be reliable, we replicated it a year after. And again, once again, the same outcome. After having done this in Brazil, we tried to replicate it in Spain using, this time, neuroimaging techniques. Again, no differences between ayahuasca users versus the controls. In some variables, yes, neuropsychological patterns and personality issues, but I won't focus on this now. But we found modifications in terms of the frontal cortex, so the continued use of ayahuasca would cause changes in the frontal cortex, just like any other practice will imply some physical changes, like, you know, starting to play the piano. After some months in the motor areas of the brain, we would clearly see a change at the level of the brain cortex. And we found this also for people who would continuously use ayahuasca, without this having any repercussion on the neuropsychological performance, even if ayahuasca users would score higher. And it even didn't have anything to do with the psychiatric science either. So we elucidated the potential long-term effects, and of course there are other trials involved, but we made it clear that the continuous use of ayahuasca in population based terms would not produce these sorts of issues. Then we tried to see whether one of the bias in these studies was that we would assess long-term users, and we didn't know back at the time that was a bias, because we wouldn't see people who had withdrawn from ayahuasca. So we started with this study, following up some people before using ayahuasca. We conducted some psychiatric interviews. We had them fill in some psychological questionnaires, and after having used ayahuasca, we followed them up for some months, and we saw that and also, since we didn't have a control group, we compared the baseline against a group of people who were ayahuasca experienced subjects. So ayahuasca naive versus ayahuasca experienced. After ayahuasca, over 80% of the people would show some significant improvement that persisted for 6 months. From our point of view, we found something interesting because there was a higher rate of psychological side effects, 17% if I'm not mistaken. So 7 cases of people with negative psychological effects, and some of them could even be classified as psychotic outbreaks. But no new psychiatric disorders were identified, and even people with the previous background of psychiatric disorders, actually these scores went down, and people with very negative experiences, they no longer fulfilled diagnostic criteria for some of these psychiatric disorders. In Spain, ayahuasca and drugs are forbidden. They're banned because they feel it's a public health issue. We have identified the long-term effects for consistent users of ayahuasca. We have this research line, and we do follow up people who've never used but want to use for the first time. And we think that maybe it would be a good idea to use public health indicators for populations that use some sort of substance. In the case of ayahuasca, for ayahuasca using communities, to see whether the use of ayahuasca is really or not a public health issue, evaluated with other criteria used to assess public health. So we detach from clinical parameters, we abandoned them more and more to then focus on criteria that merely have to do with public health. So we asked about body mass index, physical disease, psychological disease, exercise hours a day, diet, smokers versus non-smokers, the classical indicators that can point to the fact of whether a person is healthy or not. The ayahuasca users were no different compared to the general Spanish population. We found some differences, though, that we deemed interesting, not significant, but the diabetes rates were lower, obesity rates were lower, body mass index was more adjusted. They tended more toward reading and getting involved in cultural activities, but not much more, really. Even happiness related indexes, they would score higher than the general population. We did statistical analysis, very complicated, multiple evidence based. So this good health status, we concluded, was not to do with ayahuasca. But for people who are regular users of ayahuasca, this is another way, one more way to take care of themselves. Just like other people do yoga, others do mindfulness, others go on a diet. These people use ayahuasca as another way to take care of themselves. So ayahuasca could be perfectly integrated as one more practice for self-care in the contemporary studies. Maya Kohek will speak in another room one of the days of the Congress, and she will talk about one of the ethnographical studies that we are doing. And what we are assessing here quantitatively, she is recording from an ethnographic perspective in rural populations in Catalonia. There is another paper, it will be presented by Deborah this evening, and it's about the Temple of the Way of Light. 200 people have been followed up before and after using ayahuasca to assess 4 groups of symptoms: PTSD, mourning, anxiety, and depression. And Deborah Gonzalez will talk about this later on. And if you were here in the morning in the opening ceremony, you've seen the members of Umiyak. They will be speaking later on, and that's the idea. That's our perspective. Knowledge needs to be multidisciplinary, but also cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary. So we are trying to work in order to convey this knowledge from the indigenous knowledge to scientific bodies to incorporate the indigenous perspective into our pieces of research. In Europe, we also do other studies, validations, subjective effects questionnaires, when there are letters to the editor reporting some intoxication due to ayahuasca, we study it to see if, and we replicate it in case there were any methodological errors. This is a survey that we published about patterns and benefits for people that not just use ayahuasca, but they actually use natural substances like peyote or fungi, mushrooms, and with some psychological health indices. We found interesting differences between the users of natural substances vis-a-vis this new trend that has been called now psychoactive substance. And from some drug control perspective, they try to incorporate the natural substances in this sort of box, one size fits all, with the substances that belong to indeed very different pharmacological origins and very difficult to relate to each other, really. I would like to thank the members of our team. Without them at ICEERS, this would not have been possible. Some people are not on the picture, but of course they've contributed much, and it's been their job more than mine, even if I'm here presenting it. Last but not least, let me just say that in Europe there are other interesting research works being conducted studying the therapeutical potential, psychological basis. Also, we will hear more about this from other colleagues, but that's really what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much, and we'll have 20 minutes for questions later. Thank you.